welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. Episode 98, Admiral Hood of the British Navy. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to our Patreon supporters. We could not produce this podcast day in and day out without your help. If you'd like to support this podcast monetarily and see our ad-free bonus content, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcasts in other ways, please go to YouTube, find our page, and hit the subscribe button. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have a very honored guest joining the line. We have the great Oliver Webb-Carter. How are you, sir?
John, it's great to be on. You probably say that about all your guests, but thank you.
No. I'm glad you're on the line again. And for those listeners who don't know Ollie, he has a wonderful podcast called Aspects of History. Could you tell my listeners a bit about that podcast and what goes on there?
Yes, of course. It's a podcast that's dedicated to history, like yours is, but we take slightly, as the name suggests, aspects of history. We cover everything from the ancient world all the way up to the relatively recent past. We also occasionally speak to historical fiction authors as well. But really, it's a podcast that's built around authors of books. So if they've got a book coming out or there's a book that interests me, I'll get them on the pod and we'll have a chat about it. So we've talked about all sorts of different subjects really recently. We also have a bit of a film club. We have a film club where we do once a month. We talk about a historical film. So we've done one on the Mutiny on the Bounty, about the film The Bounty with Mel Gibson, actually, which we'll maybe talking about later.
And you did one on the new Napoleon film, I saw.
Yeah, we did. And then I had a chat with, I think you've had Adam Zamoyski on.
Yep. Great guess. Yep.
Yeah. So I talked about the film Napoleon with Adam, and he didn't have much time for it.
Totally understood. If you want to see aspects of history of the podcast, you can go to Spotify. It's on YouTube as well, and anywhere else podcasts are heard, correct?
That's right. Everywhere, hopefully.
Yep. And there's some new content there, some D-Day content that I think my listeners would enjoy too. It's really doing well and getting a lot of downloads.
Yeah, it's been weird. I've been sort of hitting my computer going, are you sure the numbers are right there? But yeah, D-Day's been great. We did D-Day Pegasus Bridge, D-Day the SAS, and then we did D-Day the Operation Overlord. And then for our film club, we did The Longest Day.
Well, who are we going to talk about today? And we're going to dovetail him into the end of our discussion. Who are we discussing today?
We are talking Samuel Hood, the first Viscount Hood.
Okay. And you are sort of related to him, correct?
I am I'm pretty sure I've got this right. I am a direct descendant of Samuel Hood. My grandmother was called Rosemary Hood. And so she could trace her parentage back to Samuel Viscount Hood. And I checked with my dad, who's probably many of your listeners have relatives who are obsessed with Ancestry.com, and he's confirmed it. So that's about as official as it can get, I think, John.
Yeah, that sounds good. And we'll kind of dive in from there. We'll follow the timeline backwards here. He was born in Somerset County in England, 1724. What do we know of his early life?
Well, it's quite interesting because I know you are going to likely ask about Horatio Nelson later on in the conversation. Nelson is similar to Samuel Hood. His father was a vicar. And so Samuel Hood, and I should also highlight that it can get very confusing talking about hoods and admirals, because there were 4 hoods, all similar age, who all joined the Royal Navy. Samuel Hood and his younger brother Alexander Hood both became admirals. They both also, to confuse biographers, died in the same year. And so. Died within 2 years of each other. And then he also had a cousin called Samuel Hood. So Samuel's cousin Samuel became an admiral also, and then he had another cousin called Alexander, same name as his own brother, who died as a captain in battle. So there are lots of Hoods, and it's quite it can be quite confusing. There aren't any contemporary biographies of Hood himself, and he was a significant figure. So it's a little bit surprising. There was a book written, I think, in the 50s by a Hood descendant called Dorothy Hood, who wrote a book on the Admiral's Hood.
And I know he has an excellent naval career, but maybe like you said, with Nelson and some of Sidney Smith and some of the other, there's so many naval officers at this time that are really great. Maybe he kind of gets, white noise a bit.
I think that's certainly true. I wonder also if it is something as silly as there's so many Hoods, people just get a bit confused. But he is the most prominent Hood.
Okay.
He's a little bit of an older generation than Nelson and Sidney Smith, of course, both of whom Nelson serves briefly under Hood, as does Sidney Smith,
Mm-hmm.
but he doesn't come from a traditional naval background. He is the first really to join the Royal Navy, and it is he who begins this sort of great dynasty of naval officers who uh, go all the way down into the First World War with Admiral Hood, who fought at Jutland.
Right.
So it's him and his brother were from Somerset, not a particularly seafaring county, and their father didn't really want them to join the Navy. I think a sibling had drowned. That might have been the reason for it. But he joined the Royal Navy on the urging of a family friend, and
Yeah. He
quite
joined.
late. Joined quite late.
Right. Yeah, he joins in 1741. What do we know of his first postings and assignments?
In the 7 Years' War, which begins in 1756, and that's the most significant. That's the most significant conflict, probably of the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
It lasted till 1763, and this is where Hood begins to. He fights much of the 7 Years' War around the English Channel and the North Sea. He does go out to the across the Atlantic, but really it's around the English Channel, which around then, I mean, it's still today. It's just sort of very bad weather and very busy shipping lane, and so it was a key part of the naval war in support of the British allies on the continent under Frederick the Great, and so that's where he really sort of cuts his teeth as a naval officer.
Okay. So he kind of works his way up, and in July 1756, he's promoted to captain. So basically, it takes him 15 years to kind of move up the ranks. Is this considered fast, slow, or normal in the Royal Navy at this time? Because I'm used to talking about like generals in Napoleon, where like Marshal Lannes was elected lieutenant his first day on the job. French Revolutionary generals are going from captain to brigade general like in a week. So I'm used to very fast promotions. Is this normal for the Royal Navy? Does it take 15 years to become a captain? How is he moving through the ranks?
It's pretty normal, actually.
Okay.
I mean, the figure who looms over all this conversation really is Nelson, who's a bit of a bit of a freak when it comes to swift promotions. I mean, Nelson is dead at the age of 47,
Right.
and by then he's been promoted to admiral. So much of the Royal Navy, it's when comparing it to France, and particularly the France of Napoleon, where the norms of promotion, that probably even under the Bourbons prior to the revolution, would have been a little bit more formal. That's certainly the case in the Royal Navy. And so, yeah, I think 15, 16 years until he becomes captain is pretty standard, actually.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the 7 Years' War, which many consider the first World War. Does he performs pretty well, right? Like people are noticing like this is a natural leader. This guy, he knows what he's doing. He does well in the 7 Years'
Yeah, he
War.
does. I mean, you're right. So it's me mentioned as the first. Well, I think that was Winston Churchill actually described it as the First World War. So you have, and I studied this at school. This is quite unusually actually. The 7 Years' War covered vast distances and all the continents. I think the only continent that wasn't involved was Antarctica. So there's fighting in India. There's fighting. There's the odd involvement in quite a bit actually in Africa, and then South Central and North America. Yes, so that's really a kind of lays the groundwork for future Revolutionary War, which is where Hood really makes his name during the French Revolution, during the American Revolution. But but fighting in the 7 Years' War, as I mentioned, he predominantly based around the south coast of England, along the English Channel, and ensuring shipping lanes are maintained so that Britain's trade, is unmolested, which by the French, which is really the kind of driving force behind much of the Royal Navy's involvement in fighting. Really, is to preserve Britain's trading supremacy.
Right.
Deciding which credit card or loan is right for you is like trying to choose where you want to eat for dinner. Except when you finally get to the restaurant, the menu's riddled with jargon that no average foodie could understand. So at Credit Karma, we keep things simple. We show you personalized recommendations that align with your money goals and help you turn the confusing fine print into terms you can actually understand. And as a cherry on top, we provide a detailed overview for a new card or loan before you apply. That way, we can help you make decisions faster and with more confidence. Download Intuit Credit Karma today to get started.
Moving along the story, in 1778, he receives the title of baronet, which I believe is a noble title, and serves in the American War of Independence. But it seems the war isn't very popular with everyone in the British Navy. What is Hood's role in this war?
Well, so the Royal Navy during the American Revolutionary War was actually, they had a very good Revolutionary War.
Until the end. Yeah.
Even one could argue to the end. As you're probably aware, the Americans didn't really have a navy to speak of. They had a number of privateers who could sort of annoy the Royal Navy by maybe occasionally disrupting some trade. But once a sort of frigate from the Royal Navy appeared, then the privateers would disappear, and there wasn't really much they could do about it. And so up until the French involvement in the American Revolution, which takes place in 1778 with the alliance between the newly declared 13 colonies and the French, who at the time are still, this is pre-revolution, so we're under the French, the Bourbon dynasty. And that's where things do slightly take a different turn for the Royal Navy. There are a number of engagements that Hood is involved in. Probably, predominantly the most famous one that we should probably talk about is towards the end of the Revolutionary War, 1781.
Yep.
And this is the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. And so with this battle, it's quite interesting actually. So the Royal Navy is the fleet sailing up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States was really there to provide support for the army, and in particular in 1781, Cornwallis is looking to evacuate from Yorktown, and so the plan that the Royal Navy had under Admiral Thomas Graves, and Hood was his second in command, was to sail from New York. Graves appears in New York with only about 5 ships, I think it was, and unites with Hood's 14 ship So they head to Yorktown,
Yep.
where Cornwallis is really making a hash of fighting the revolutionaries, and so needs to be evacuated. And so this is where the French appear under the Comte de Grasse,
Hmm.
a French aristocrat in charge of the French the navy, to disrupt this plan. And what happens is really it's a kind of classic 18th century battle, in that it ends with a victory for the French, but it's not a particularly decisive victory. For much of the 18th century, naval doctrine was really, I mean, the sail ships, so they're reliant on the wind, and so the what would happen was you would get two fleets who want to who fight each other, reliant on wind, hope to sail adjacent to each other and fire their cannon until one side basically breaks off because they don't want to lose any ships. Each ship is worth, I think, in today's money, I mean, similar to an aircraft carrier in the US Navy now, they're hugely expensive.
Right. And they would usually fight to draws. Very rarely were there Battle of the Niles or Trafalgar's where it was like a landslide victory. Most of them were draws.
Well, this is where Hood becomes quite interesting because, and the battle that we're going to talk about after Chesapeake
Yep.
is where he, and it really is Hood's plan, is to break the line. And
Yeah.
for those listeners who are familiar with Nelson and in particular Trafalgar, Nelson's brilliance, and he does it with two lines of ships as they break the French and Spanish lines at Trafalgar. And really, that was a revolutionary. It was a real step forward in naval tactics. As I said, much of the 18th century, they didn't really have. You would be lucky to capture one or two ships from your opponent, because they would break off and depart if things were looking a bit dicey. Basically, that's what happens at Chesapeake. The French do defeat the Royal Navy, but Graves and Hood elect to depart and head to New York and lick their wounds there. New York, which was, a loyal city throughout the American Revolution.
And that oddly seals the final victory for the Americans. But in 1782, in an odd twist of fate, Hood and Admiral Rodney defeat de Grasse in a battle in the West Indies and captures the French captain and brings him to England as a prisoner. So talk about a feeling of redemption for Hood, right? He lost, well, not lost, but he had a draw off in 1780. To come back 2 years later to beat the same guy is pretty incredible.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say Chesapeake was a defeat, but
Yeah.
but it wasn't a catastrophic one. For much of the American Revolutionary War was really an excuse for the French to cause the British Empire problems, and there's no real great love for the ideals of the French Revolution. The French monarchy was in charge, so
Right.
And where do you do that best? You do it in the West Indies, where British interests are sugar and other crops, but predominantly sugar. And
Mhm.
I think it was Jamaica was the real cash cow for the British Empire at the time.
Yep.
Assisted with slavery, you had huge amounts of sugar being shipped back to fuel this new craze in Britain, which was for tea.
Mhm.
And coffee and
Mhm.
to put sugar in these drinks where everyone was going crazy for them, and it was providing vast sums for His Majesty's treasury.
Mhm.
Now so the French head there to disrupt British trade, and so obviously the Americans don't have any interests in the West Indies at the time.
Mhm.
And so the battle that we're talking about is the Battle of the Saints, so named
Yeah.
after the West Indian islands, St. Kitts and St. Nevis. So Admiral Rodney, Rodney had been a bit of a mentor to Hood.
Mhm.
Hood was a midshipman under Rodney when in the War of Austrian Succession. But Rodney took ill and had to go back to England, then returned. Hood was the mainstay of that fleet when he during this time,
Mhm.
and in 1782, the two fleets under De Grasse and Hood / Rodney. Hood then breaks the French line with this brilliant maneuver, which he later sort of creates a flag signal for, which
Mhm.
is then issued and becomes part of orders run up by flag in the Royal Navy. And at that time, you had to signal through flags rather than
Right.
any other way. And so, yes, I think 5 ships are captured or destroyed, which is a crushing defeat for the French. And yes, you're absolutely right. De Grasse is returns to England. I think he has an audience with George III, and is involved in the Treaty of Paris when the two sides, the newly formed United States, make peace with the British Empire.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting turn of events, and another interesting turn of events. We kind of previewed it earlier. Hood around this time becomes sort of a mentor for Horatio Nelson, who goes on to become the most famous commander probably in naval history for Britain. What do we know about their dynamic? Can he fully take? I guess he can't take credit for anyone's career fully, but he at least steers Nelson in the right direction.
He does. I think there's a quote that is often mentioned here that Nelson gives. Hood was the best officer, take him all together, that England has to boast of.
Hmm.
So that does, imply some kind of affection there, but I'm not sure. It's difficult to find much more evidence of sort of real kind of mentoring. Other than the fact that I think the real mentor for Nelson was Maurice Suckling, who was his uncle, who
Yep.
rose to become postmaster, controller for the Royal Navy, the purse
Yeah.
strings for the Royal Navy.
Yeah.
So I suspect he was a little bit more of a mentor for Nelson. Hood and Nelson didn't serve together for any great length of time, which is why
Okay.
it's probably less likely.
Well, during peacetime after the Revolutionary War, Hood becomes a member of Parliament. And interestingly, he presides over the famous court martial related to the mutiny on the Bounty, which I know you mentioned one of your podcasts before he came on is on the Mutiny of the Bounty, the movie starring Mel Gibson. Is this true? Does he serve on this court martial, and what goes on here?
He most certainly does. He presides over the court martial, and Hood is in the film played by Laurence Olivier, great actor of the age, plays Lord Hood.
But they're not prosecuting Bligh or
No. Bligh is at the court martial to give evidence. There are 10 mutineers who are in the dock, as it were, and they are accused of, overthrowing the Bligh and a number of his officers and taking control of HMS Bounty. And as we mentioned before, this was a big deal for the Royal Navy. These ships were hugely expensive. And so the loss of a ship in such circumstances had to be dealt with properly. And I think Hood comes across in the transcripts of the court martial as he does come across as a sort of slight reactionary. I think he gives a indication before the court martial proceedings have even begun that he views all the defendants as pretty much guilty, and he doesn't go so far as to put on the black cap before the proceedings begin, but he.
right.
I think it's pretty certain that if they are found guilty, then Hood will not be merciful.
And I think some of them are hung, but not all of them. They're all found guilty, I think. But
Yes, 6 are hanged from the yardarm of a Royal Navy vessel. 4 are let go.
Well, getting back to our timeline, in 1793, following the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars, Hood becomes commander of the Mediterranean Fleet French royalists and anti-revolutionaries opened the large French port of Toulon to the British Navy, and Hood and the Navy kind of take control of this vital port until a guy named, let me look up his name here, Napoleon Bonaparte shows up. What kind of happens from there?
Well, so this is interesting, and your listeners have probably been wondering why the hell is Hood on a podcast about Napoleon, but now we know, and it is the Siege of Toulon. But I should just mention, before Hood's appointment as Admiral of the Blue in charge of the fleet in the Mediterranean, he's getting on a bit now. He's in his late 60s, 69. I think he is when he's appointed to the command of the fleet and gets involved in Toulon. Prior to that, he was made commander-in-chief and given a nice posting in Portsmouth. And that was looking like he would settle down and live the life of a retired admiral and probably drink his body weight in port. But he does. I think the problem for the Navy at the time is that there weren't that many admirals of real talent, and this might be actually a failing of Hood's, in that there is. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the naval historian Andrew Lambert, who's very distinguished historian. And he makes the convincing point that the trouble with Hood was that he was a little bit almost contemptuous of junior officers. Wasn't allowing of their failures or mistakes, unlike Nelson, who would allow officers to make mistakes and then learn from their mistakes. Hood wasn't like that, and so it meant that there weren't as many senior naval officers who could really take on a role. Take on the job that the command of the fleet in the Mediterranean needed really. And so yes, he does, but he does show his kind of brilliance at the same time, because admirals in the Royal Navy had been executed for making mistakes in the past. Admiral Byng, who is the most famous example of that, who inspired the quote from Voltaire, his death was pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. And what Hood does is, when the royalists who invite Hood in to take the city, or at least the French fleet, he says yes immediately. He doesn't check with London. He goes ahead. Now, I don't think there are any other senior admirals, senior naval officers who would have done that, apart from maybe Sidney Smith and then later Nelson.
One of the largest ports in France, and definitely along the Mediterranean, with the French fleet sitting there. I mean, how could you pass up that opportunity?
I suppose so. Yes, absolutely. And actually, Napoleon, in his own way, takes the city. There's not a lot that Hood can do about that. He's on his ship. But he does destroy the French fleet in which, of course, would have been taken by Napoleon and then used probably against England later. So Hood comes out of Toulon really quite well, and particularly when one takes into account his age.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like, until Napoleon showed up, the French generals in charge had no idea how to get the British Navy out of there. Like, do we storm the city? How do we force them to leave with their ships? And Napoleon said, well, you don't need to take the city. You just need to take the bluffs kind of overlooking the city and then lob shells onto the ships.
Exactly. Hood saw that, actually, he saw that Napoleon had the high ground. She wouldn't have known who Napoleon was at the time, but he would have seen that the writing was on the wall, that Toulon was going to fall, so he may as well act and destroy the French fleet. But it is interesting because Hood, and this is 1793, so we're still in the French Revolution. This is the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, pre-Napoleon, the rise of Napoleon. I mean, this starts his rise, but this is a kind of a changing of an era, I think, particularly in the Royal Navy, where Hood is of a different generation. he's from a previous generation. He might have been one of the shining lights of that generation, but I think this is where he fades. Sidney Smith is very prominent in carrying out Hood's orders and very effective. But I think this is where you see a passing of the baton, and he's very much an 18th century admiral, Hood.
Well, after assisting with the occupation of Napoleon's home island of Corsica, Hood is recalled after he complains he doesn't have enough ships to defend the Med. Is this accurate, or do you think he was just getting old and didn't want to do this anymore, or what happened there?
Well, so Hood by this stage is, I mean, you're right. He's 70 now. But I think that he didn't have any clear orders from the Admiralty. And I think also by putting into writing the fact that he required more more ships, as you rightly point out, that is making a statement that the Admiralty have to either back up or they have to recall him, which is what they did.
Right.
That way, he can't be accused of failure.
Right.
And as I mentioned before, that was I think something that was ever present in admirals' minds in this period. I think that it can't be overstated how significant the death, he was court. Admiral Byng was court-martialed for the loss of Majorca, I think it was. And his death sent shockwaves through the Royal Navy.
It's hard to be in charge, like kind of like the generals of the French Revolutionary era. Like if you're a French general and you're too zealous and you lose a battle, you're going to get guillotined. But if you're too defensive and you let the armies of your opponents just take over territory, you're also going to get guillotined. So you have to find that middle ground somehow.
Yes, I think this is an example of Hood being a little bit canny, actually, and and avoiding a similar fate, which is unlikely because he had built up such a reputation by then. But it meant his reputation, I guess, at least was preserved.
Well, what were his later years like? I know he got married and he had a son.
Well, I mean, he then I think he's raised to the Irish peerage and lives the life of a retired admiral. He is actually, you've all heard of Nelson's column, I'm sure. Hood has his own column in Somerset. Okay. Yes.
All right.
It's 300. It's 33 meters in height, over 115 feet. That is in American, I think. On top is a ship with say 4 ships. I think the ships that he served in. There's no actual statue of him, unlike Nelson's column, but there is a column nonetheless for Hood.
Okay. Well, I know he dies, I think in 1816, and I'd like to talk about his legacy, which should also include the Hood battleship in World War II that's named after him. But what do you think that his legacy is as an admiral? Because he was in service a long time.
Well, I think he had been quite. I mentioned, rather than a mentor for Nelson, probably quite inspirational for Nelson, particularly that breaking of the line maneuver. I think the other thing that I think one of his legacies was probably more negative, and I've mentioned it, is he didn't really encourage too many of the next generation, wasn't very good at delegating, and so therefore is not there are as well as Nelson. I think Fremantle was another of his officers who did rise to the top, but there were other naval officers who were less good, but were encouraged by Hood, but they didn't have the talent that Nelson and Fremantle had. So I think that was probably a weakness of his. But he shifted the Royal Navy from the 18th century into the 19th by their actions in the West Indies, and I think the Toulon escapade preserved Royal Navy supremacy in the Mediterranean for the near future.
Yeah, it's interesting you point that out, that he didn't allow a lot of independent thought in his subordinates, because Napoleon gets the same critique. Like, they were supposed to just follow his orders to the letter. But when you do that, you kind of inhibit the growth and learning of your subordinates. Like, how are they supposed to become better independent commanders if you don't let them do anything independently? So that's an interesting gripe on Hood.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to come out of uh, historians' assessments with a particularly brilliant reputation. I mean, Nelson sort of he overshadows every naval officer, certainly after his death.
Yeah.
But his actions in Naples leave a lot to be desired.
Yep.
Um, and and so important not to big up Admiral Hood, my ancestor, too much. He wasn't perfect.
Well, let's talk about the Hood battleship, who he's named after, and this will kind of dovetail nicely into your D-Day podcast. The ship was laid down, I believe, in World War One, and I think it was involved at Jutland. And then what happened to the battleship? It was, for 20 years, I think, the largest warship in the world.
Yeah, it was a massive warship. It built in 1916, or began to be built in 1916, but it took 2 years to build.
Mm.
So it only set sail in August 1918. So by then, there's only a couple of months to go. So it didn't take part in the Battle of Jutland, but Admiral Hood, who was a descendant of Samuel Hood, did take part in the Battle of Jutland and was killed.
Okay.
And then, yes, the Hood was then at the time, I think, the largest battleship in the world. But by World War II, it's then sort of it's beginning to show its age, and it's sunk in 1941 in and around Denmark, not far actually from Jutland. Interestingly,
yeah, involved in the Bismarck pursuit, right?
That's right, and it's a direct hit on the magazine that does for the Hood, and it's actually pretty tragic. There are a little over 1,400 men on board.
Yeah, and I read it was a big blow to British naval prestige because they thought it was like an unsinkable ship.
Well, I think it's more of its reputation rather than its, by 1941, whether it was a particularly it was vast. It was a sort of great physical manifestation of the might of the Royal Navy. This is the Royal Navy that, since Trafalgar, had ruled the waves. After Jutland in World War One, the Germans had I mean, there's argument over whether it was a draw or a defeat for Britain, but the German Navy didn't return to sea after Jutland, so one could argue that the Royal Navy won. But yeah, so the Hood is this kind of manifestation of national nautical pride, rather than it being particularly advanced technologically by that stage. And a lot of these ships around the early 20th century had this weakness with the magazine. And this is what happened. And as I mentioned, over 1,400 men were the ship's complement. Only 3 survived.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that.
It's sunk to the bottom.
Well, that again comes back to your podcast. If you'd like to learn more about D-Day or any aspects of history, Ollie has a podcast related to that. So please check that out. And yeah, that was a good overview of Samuel Hood. I appreciate your time, Ollie. Really good stuff. You can find Ollie anywhere podcasts are heard, and we're happy to have him on the show.
Thank you, John. It's been a great pleasure talking about Samuel Hood. He doesn't get the attention that maybe he deserves.
I agree.